All right, so what we could move on to now is a bit of XSS. And this, I'm going to warn you, this is the biggest problem I've found in your site.
Is that one of the points on the OWASP thing as well?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. It's a very good feed-in. So let's go up a page here. So XSS is number 3. Now,
Yeah, right.
Interestingly, XSS was number 2 in the 2010 edition, and it's dropped a little bit.
Okay,
So
still in top 3.
Well, either that's gotten better or broken authentication has got
Yeah,
worse.
right.
But you know what I reckon it is? I reckon XSS has actually gotten better, because when we look at things like MVC, you get a lot of native defences against it. And we should go and have a look at what that is. So what we'll do is we will make something somewhere, and I think I'm going to make another category again. And what I'm going to do is we'll create a category, and we can probably get rid of that guy now. We want to put something in here that's going to potentially be a risk, and we'll see how it handles it. So we'll say something like this is, and then we'll put in a little EM tag. Really cool. Now the question here is going to be, and again, you can do this with any app. You can hack. I mean, of course, I say this. It's not really hacking if it's just angle brackets, is it? But you could put this into any website and see how it handles it.
But this, to be fair, this could be a category name you want. No, I want to bold this. If you are a user that's just learned HTML, you go, oh, I know I can do this.
Now, so this is a slippery slope. So you've got to decide, do you want to allow markup?
Yeah.
Because if you want to allow markup, you've got to start allowing tags. And if you want to allow tags, then you've got to decide which tags you don't want to allow.
Like a script tag.
Like a script tag.
Yeah.
Or do you, what if you say, okay, we want to allow script tags, but we'll allow everything else, and someone creates an EM tag, and then they put an on mouse over event, which calls JavaScript. It's not a script tag, it still calls JavaScript.
I knew you'd come up with something.
Slippery slope. And then what if they start encoding things, and it just goes on and on. Let's see what happens.
Ow.
We'll give that a bit of foo.
Yep.
And we'll see what happens next.
Oh.
This is your funky error. Oh, I'm on the search page, Lars.
We'll fix it.
So you know what's happened here? I bet you this is request validation again. So request validation has said, we're not going to accept this particular request because it could contain XSS, which it kind of did. So there's that. So here's what would normally happen. What I would like to see in an application that handles this properly is when I go back and I look at that category name, I see it repeated just as I entered it. So let's go back to what we entered. So I would see it in the list, rendered like this to the screen. Now to render it like this to the screen, in the HTML source, that less than bracket has to ampersand LT semicolon.
Exactly.
So it has to be output encoded, and it has to be output encoded for the HTML context. With me so far?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
So, and I can't remember if this did this before, and now maybe it's doing it differently. But
yeah, well, it is a product that's alive and being supported, so it may have changed. But I understand what you're saying.
Right. So, and again, this is sort of one of those things where you got to go, is this an implicit decision and you just arrived here by default because what the framework does, or is this what you actually want to happen?
Yeah.
Now, in a case like this, so to me, and this is kind of a usability thing as well, like I wasn't really overjoyed when I saw this.
No,
like,
it's confusing.
What am I searching for?
Yeah.
So from a usability perspective, you guys probably need to go, okay, we're not going to allow angle brackets.
Yep.
And this is more than just tags. You don't want to be blacklisting and saying, we're not going to allow this tag and this tag and this tag.
Yeah.
You really want to be whitelisting and saying, for example, we will allow letters, numbers, and punctuation.
Yep.
And then angle brackets don't fall into that. So you'd have a whitelist of allowable values. Now, effectively, what's happened here is request validation's kicked in, and it's basically...
it's what we saw before with the password.
Yeah, correct, and it's done the funky error page thing.
Yeah.
So you guys want to think, do we want to allow angle brackets anywhere, which is number one? You also want to think, do I want to actually allow markup? So might you want to allow this? So might you want to allow someone to put really in italics?
Exactly. So, which is probably not as relevant in a category as in the description.
Possibly.
But still the same issue.
And then if you're going to allow that, then you've got to think about sanitization. Because to the example just before, like we want to allow the EM tag, but then we might want to not allow JavaScript to be called by things like an event such as on mouse over.
Yeah.
So then you can look at things like anti-XSS and the sanitization libraries that are in there.
Okay.
But it's a slippery slope. It's a really, really slippery slope because it's like what's good, what's bad, and there's always these new sort of...
So is the right approach to say, well, as a business, I want to allow this user behavior, and then you go from there and you say, okay, well, if that's the case, then we have to implement these rules to facilitate that behavior, rather than saying, we won't allow script tags and then deal with the user behavior?
Well, first of all, I think saying it's a business decision is probably not the right way of putting it, insofar as if you went and asked most businesses, mate, what do you reckon about EM tags? I'll go, what?
Well, not so much EM, but in terms of having a rich text editor.
Yeah, so, and this is the trick, because once you have a rich text editor, you're normally generating markup. And you're generating it on the client, and then you're effectively passing markup as untrusted data. So then you really have to look at sanitization, which effectively says we're going to strip out the bad stuff.
Yep.
So anyway, but let's move on, because there was an interesting XSS risk here, and what I'm going to do is, and this comes down to where some things are sanitized and where others aren't. Right. And hopefully no one has gone and fixed this between when we tested this just before and now. But here's an interesting thing, and I'm going to show you later how I found this as well. Okay. So this is the change password form. Yep. And what we can do is we can right-click here and we can go inspect element like this. Okay, and these inspectors are absolutely awesome for finding risks in applications, by the way. Okay. That's one of the things from the Hack Yourself First course. Yeah, right, because I've used them obviously a lot to change the CSS and then apply it. Right, and this sort of goes to that point before. I said often developers are building applications, they think they're only ever going to be used in a certain way, and then someone comes along, that's right, like me, and messes it up for them. Yeah, so here's what we're going to do. We've got a hidden field here called URL referrer ABS URI, which I assume is absolute URI. Yep. And we've got the root of your site here. Now what I'm going to do is I want to actually change this value, and I can change it to JavaScript. Okay, so I'm going to start to put a bit of JavaScript on here. This is starting to look bad. It's starting to look bad. And we might go alert, and we've got to get this absolutely perfect, otherwise nothing works. Document.cookie. Okay. So in theory, this value is now going to be passed. Now, it doesn't matter what we put into these fields. All I want to do is generate a post back. So I'm going to... As long as it's valid, I guess. Maybe yeah, so long as it meets password criteria rules. So I'll do that. This has got to be the same. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is your minimum characters. You might want to think about that too. We should have spoken about that earlier. And we're going to change password. Doesn't matter that it's incorrect password. The trick now... That didn't do anything. Well, you don't think it did. No. If the planets align and we click on the cancel button... Okay, so we have actually just been able to execute arbitrary JavaScript. So let's look at why that is. So we'll pull the DevTools back up. We'll go over to here, mouse, there. And you see here, that's where our JavaScript has ended up. So what has actually happened is we have taken the untrusted data, because even though it's a hidden input field that no one should be changing directly, there is still an HTTP or HTTPS request which passes this data. It's no more hidden than that. And it's reflected it. So this is a reflected XSS attack. It's taken untrusted user input and it's reflected it here into the HTML attribute context. Right. So this would be considered a serious risk. Okay. Now, how would you weaponize this? So if you had an attacker's page somewhere which said, look, if you click on this link, you'll get a free iPad or something like that. And they clicked on it and it caused a post to this page and injected this JavaScript into this context, and then someone clicked on the cancel link, and then it was taking the cookies and it was passing them on. Like, there's a lot of things that have to kind of join up. Sure. But I guess that the overarching context here is an attacker can get this page to execute arbitrary JavaScript. So just see if I get it right. So what you did was you took the page that was loaded originally, and you changed the value that you think is hidden, which then gets thrown back to the server, and in the new page you get delivered from the server or served, the cancel has now got a different value. So the cancel has now got a different href attribute value. Oh, a different H, so the behavior of the cancel button has been changed. Correct. Now, look, to be honest, this one, it would probably be hard to weaponize. You'd have to join quite a few dots. Sure. You particularly see XSS exploited where it's reflected from the URL, and all you do is you share a URL with someone, they load the page, and something from the URL automatically gets reflected in the page and sends you cookies off. But look, let's talk about how we'd fix this anyway, because this is one that's easy to fix. And there's two key things we could do here that would fix this. And I'd probably do them in this order. So number one is really you're missing output encoding here. So this value, this href value, should be output encoded for the HTML attribute context. So what that means is that characters here should actually be encoded. So things like your semicolon and your brackets should be encoded so that they don't actually run in the page. So that when you click on cancel, nothing would happen.
It would just break.
Exactly. So what should happen is when you click on cancel, that href would just be an invalid URL.
That's right.
Rather than a JavaScript command. So that would be number one. And you've got to remember the context is important. So when we talk about XSS, the different contexts include things like HTML. So, and we saw this before, like we talked about it before, if you encode an angle bracket for the HTML output context, it should be something like ampersand less than. HTML attributes, CSS, JavaScript. The way you encode in JavaScript is very different to the way you output encode in HTML.
Yep.
So you want to be careful about this, and this is where MVC, as much as it sets you up for success, if you were to take MVC and you were to use Razor syntax and just output an attribute straight into HTML source, that will default encode for the HTML context. If you put that in JavaScript, you get output encoding for the HTML context in the JavaScript context. So I go through this as well in my iOS Top 10 for .NET Developers course. So it's actually specifically about how .NET implements this.
Okay.
So that was one, output encoding. The other one that we want to get sorted out here is whitelisting. So what we want to say is what is an allowable value for this particular form field.
Yeah, because, well, it's supposed to be URL, so I'm guessing that brackets are not valid in URLs, for example.
Yeah, so I mean, what we'd really be talking about is what does a URL, what does a good URL comply with in terms of format? So it would be really, really easy in code behind to say, is this a valid URL?
Yeah, I would imagine you could find a number of regexes that would help you in that regard.
You could do a regex, you could actually create a new URI type, and you could do a URI try parse, and does it actually parse?
Yes, is that too?
You could go further again and say not only does it have to be a valid URL, but it actually has to be a valid one on sugarlearning.com.
That's right, which is probably the better solution.
It's a better solution. Or you could just make the whole thing a relative link, but then you've no longer got a URI type that you can validate against.
No, that's true. Yeah.
So anyway, there's a couple of different ways of fixing it.
Certainly.
Not too hard.